Today I'm going to talk to you about the movement to get Texas women on juries. First, I'm going to talk to you about why jury rights were important to these women. And then I'm going to talk about the two phases of the movement, paying special attention to generational overlaps between the suffrage movement that Dr. Ranofsky detailed and further feminist activity in the century that Dr. Baker will talk about. So first, why were jury rights important to these women? Well, women argued that there were two ways of directly participating with your government. One of those was voting rights, which had been secured by the 19th Amendment, and the other was through jury rights, so directly participating in legal judgments that are legitimized by the United States government. So these are the two ways that they argued that they're participating with the government. So Texas women immediately began arguing that if they only have suffrage rights, they still remain, quote, half citizens, and immediately began working to fulfill or get full citizenship. Moving on into the movement, I conceptualize it in two different phases. So the first phase is really the legal phase. And this is where women, particularly women lawyers, are trying to secure jury rights through court decisions. And then the second phase, which I'll get to later, is the legislative phase. So they eventually find that they're going to have to get an amendment to the Texas Constitution. And so they really turn their focus towards sort of a legislative way of gaining rights. And in each of these phases, there's an example I'm going to share with you of significant generational overlap. So that's what I really want to emphasize to you all. So starting with the first phase, this legal phase, where they tried to petition the courts for rights. Beginning in 1921, so immediately after the suffrage movement, two women, Jane Spell and Dora Adams Humphreys, were seated on a grand jury in McLennan County, Texas. Both of these women were prominent members of Waco society, and both of them were members of suffrage organizations in the city. And they assumed that voting rights extended to jury rights as well. So it's not like they had this devious backroom plan where they're like, oh, we're going to go take rights that aren't ours. They assumed that voting rights extended to jury rights as well. And the jury indicted several men on charges ranging from theft to murder. One of these men, Dick Harper, went on to be convicted of theft of property over $50. His lawyer, Shuford Farmer, was unable to avoid a conviction for his client, but saw an opportunity to get the whole thing thrown out because there was women seated on the grand jury. So eventually, this untested legal challenge makes its way to the Court of Criminal Appeals. And this is really interesting. Because the Court of Criminal Appeals argued that being a qualified voter in Texas did not automatically mean that you could sit on juries in Texas. And their reasoning was that in Article 5 of the Texas Constitution, it specifically stated that 12 men should make up juries. And although men can be broadly defined, like mankind, for example, they narrowly define the word men to biological males. And so Texas women, although they had just received a major victory from suffrage, immediately have to start organizing to pass further legislation to secure jury rights. So this really shifts us into the second phase, or the legislative phase. Some background information really quick. The women's organization most associated with the second phase is the Texas Business and Professional Women's Clubs, especially the Dallas branch of the statewide organization. So that was really the most important branch for this movement, and especially the women lawyers within that branch. The most important individual and leader of the Texas movement was Sarah Hughes, a member of the Dallas BPW, who will feature quite extensively in Dr. Baker's talk about the Equal Rights Amendment. But in this context, Hughes first supported legislative measures in the Texas House, where she served as a representative during the early 1930s and really cultivated political relationships in the legislature that would extend well beyond her term as a representative. So one particular episode early in the second phase illustrates how measures to gain women's jury rights usually progressed until it finally succeeded in the 1950s. So in 1937, the Texas BPW pledged support for the women's jury rights movement, and established a committee with a small budget to try to secure favorable legislation. The organization members immediately set up sort of backroom ways to talk with legislators and try and sway them to secure favorable legislation. And a perfect example of this is in 1939 with the 46th legislature. In the Texas House, House Joint Resolution number 21 attempted to remove sex as a qualifier for jury service. And just for like generational overlap, like that type of language is a direct generational overlap from voting rights. So they're even using the same language. House Representative William O. Reed of Dallas introduced the resolution, and Sarah Hughes later commented that the Dallas BPW, quote, urged Reed to support the amendment. And when Sarah Hughes urges you to do something, I think you usually do it. After an impassioned speech from the chair of the legislative committee to the House Committee on Constitutional Amendments, the joint resolution was favorably recommended. They're really drawing upon these political connections to really work this legislation through the House. However, the Texas Senate proved much more difficult, and it would throughout the movement. However, a chief ally in the Texas Senate was Senator Penrose B. Metcalfe of San Angelo. Excuse me. And Metcalfe's support is really interesting because it fulfills a family legacy of supporting women's rights causes and also illustrates the importance of male allies in all of the movements we're talking about today. So Metcalfe's support, Charles Metcalfe, Penrose's father, supported legislation that got Texas women the right to vote in primaries in 1917. And almost immediately after the 19th Amendment, Penrose is in the Texas Senate supporting jury rights legislation as well, which is really interesting. He remains a chief supporter of women's rights causes throughout his career in the Texas Senate. However, as I mentioned, the Texas Senate was less favorable, and the resolution died in the Texas Senate's Committee on Constitutional Amendments. Although 1935 was a legislative failure, it really illustrates the broad political networks that women are engaging in, the legacy of the suffrage movement, and the difficulty of gaining broad support in the legislature. However, they eventually do gain broad support in the legislature, and in 1954, a resolution to propose a constitutional amendment to guarantee jury rights for women in Texas passed through the Texas legislature. But in order for it to take full effect, it had to be voted on by the public. And so in the second phase, you really see a shift from, it's still based on legislation, but it's a shift from courting politicians to courting the public. So they have to engage in really a public relations campaign. And members of the Texas BPW had a tough time convincing men and women to vote for the referendum. And you might say, why? Why would that be difficult to do? Well, many people simply dislike jury duty, right? It's not something that you really want to sign up for. So a lot of women argued, hey, let the men have that, right? We don't need it. But there's also other more serious criticisms. Critics argued that jury duty was more time-consuming than voting. Who would be watching the children was a legitimate question for these people. Critics also argued that women should not be exposed to violent details of crime. So really this sense of protecting women in society. The bottom line is that many of the criticisms of jury service centered on potentially upsetting the gender systems of Texas, something that the critics of suffrage and the later ERA both feared and expressed. But as I mentioned, there's finally success in 1954, and the first jury composed entirely of women was also compiled that year out of Dallas County, symbolizing women's victory in the jury rights movement. So overall, both phases of the jury rights movement had significant generational overlap from both the suffrage movement and the women's rights movement. However, just like suffrage rights, jury rights did not extend blanket equality to Texas women. For the realization of that goal, further feminist activism was needed in the coming years. And that leads directly to you.